what we talked about in our first session was how Zephaniah was speaking not only for his own time, the last days of Judah coming, the Babylonian captivity, but how it speaks for the last days. It keeps using phrases, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. This tells us and shows us that what happened in the last days of Judah is a foreshadowing of what happens in the last days before Jesus comes back, or when Jesus comes back. And so we continue now in chapter 2. Gather yourselves together, yes, gather, O nation without shame. Before the decree takes effect, the day passes like the shadow. Before the burning anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. What it's saying is this: gather yourselves together, O nation, without shame. When things that were considered to be disgraceful, reprobate, become acceptable and mainstream, that is a society, a nation, and a civilization in trouble, and the judgment of God is looming. When there is no shame in having children out of wedlock, when there's no shame in homosexuality and lesbianism, when there is no shame in things that are morally reprobate, it's just socially acceptable conduct, that signals the anger and judgment of God. Now, of course, all the great civilizations of the world, Rome, Babylon, Assyria, they all went through this process. But so did Israel. In the last days of Israel, the 10 northern tribes that we read about in Hosea and Amos and so forth, and also in the last days of Judah, that Zephaniah is warning about. Again, the name Zephaniah comes from the Hebrew infinitive to hide, to hide. Then it continues. The Lord's anger is burning. When people are so demonstrably devoid of any moral foundation in what they, the Lord's anger begins to burn. In the United States, this past week, the state of Massachusetts, that was where the pilgrims came on the Mayflower and so forth, fleeing King James and looking for religious freedom and things of this nature. It had a biblical foundation as a state, or known as a commonwealth. Now, it went wrong because of the Calvinists and the Salem witch trials and all of that stuff, but there was still some kind of a Judeo-Christian premise to its foundation. Last week, Massachusetts voted that a 16-year-old girl is allowed to have an abortion without parental consent. You're allowing legally underage girls, legally underage, under the age of sexual consent, that if somebody who's over that age has sexual relations with her, they could be charged with statutory rape. But she has a right to an abortion, even a publicly funded abortion at the expense of the taxpayers. Doesn't have to inform her parents. They have no say in it. And if they object, tough. This is the world we live in. This is what America has come to. This is what Britain has come to. Now let's begin to understand what happens. We are then told in verse 3, seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth, who have carried out his ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. God stops appealing to the societies and the nations at large. He appeals to those within those societies and nations who abide by his word, who follow, who carry out his ordinances. They don't just give lip service and say, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. They live by what they claim to believe. They live by what they claim to believe. Then it continues. There's a possibility of being hidden from the wrath to come. We are not appointed unto wrath. Tribulation, that's going to happen. It's always happened. Wrath, judgment of God, not. Remember, tribulation comes from Satan, wrath comes from God. The wrath of God is worse than the tribulation of Satan when we read the book of Revelation, much worse. Then it begins speaking of events in the Middle East, specifically to do with Israel at that particular time. For Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon a desolation. Ashdod will be driven out at noon, and Ekron will be uprooted. Woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you. So there will be no inhabitant. So the seacoast will be pastures with caves for shepherds and folds for flocks. And the coast will be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They will pasture on it. And the houses of Ashkelon, they will lie down at the evening. For the Lord their God will care for them and restore their fortune. Notice that before a restoration comes a destruction. Now, it's very conspicuous that these locations now, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, south of the area south of Tel Aviv, in between Tel Aviv and the Sinai, along the coast where the Gaza Strip is, and the associated or the adjacent areas. This was the land, had been the land of the Philistines, strategically suppressed by David, but then it got out of control again. And presented a strategic threat to Judah that God let happen. Well, once again, you see this. Now, a replay. In the modern age, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. It was forced to capture Gaza in self-defense in 1967. What the world does not tell you, but those who are in a position to know, such as the World Health Organization, that Gaza had been impoverished before 1967 to the point of astronomical infant mortality, very low longevity, that the standard of living and everything from employment to longevity to reduced infant mortality, it improved 370% under the Israelis. The Israelis withdrew unilaterally under international pressure, gave up Gaza. They were going to make a Palestinian state, and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas had a civil war with each other, exterminated each other. Hamas comes out in control of Gaza while the Palestinian Authority retains control of the Muslim Arab communities of the West Bank. So now you don't have a two-state solution or a three-state. You've got two rival Palestinian states in waiting, the way it stands. And they're firing Katyushas. Where are they firing the Katyushas? Well, at Ashkelon, at Sderot, at that the same area. These same things that happened then are happening again now. And a massive destruction came to that area in the last days of Judah. Well, a massive destruction is going to come again. The Gaza Strip is going to be emaciated. There will be significant damage to the surrounding Israeli cities. Kiryat Gat, Ashkelon, and Ashdod will all be within target range. You've got a ton of people in Gaza, controlled by demonized madmen, Hamas. Something eventually will happen again that will not just resemble, but to some degree replay what happened circa 585 BC. Well, let's continue to look. There will be a restoration of the fortune of Judah, but it will only be for certain people. Verse 8, I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon, with which they have taunted my people and become arrogant against their territory. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom, and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them. Now, understand the following. Moab, of course, is southern Jordan. Ammon is northern Jordan. Moab is central Jordan. The very south of Jordan is Edom. 7 out of 10 people, 70% of the population of Jordan, are Palestinian Arabs. It is a Palestinian state. It was founded by the British as a Palestinian state after World War I, except that it had a Hashemite government. Hashemites being the tribe from Saudi Arabia. And it has a Bedouin minority of about 30% of the population. But Yasser Arafat made claims in 1970 that Jordan is Palestine, and the Jordanians admitted it. King Hussein of Jordan admitted it. There is a hostility that is endemic. It does not change between the inhabitants of Jordan and the inhabitants of Judah and Israel. Although the Arabians and the Gulf states, the Emirates, may seek peace with Israel because of a common fear of Iran and so forth, the Palestinians remain hostile and will continue to do so. The Palestinian Arabs, so-called, remain hostile. Now, this prophecy, where there's an obliteration that you don't know where anything was, like happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. When God destroys something the way he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it's obliterated to the point that there's no trace of where it even was. This has never historically happened. In the intertestamental Hasmonean period, this area did come under the strategic control of Israel. It was from here the Idumeans came, Edomites who converted to Judaism, Herod the Great being one of them. His parents were Idumeans, and they migrated west into the northern Negev. But the rest of this prophecy, it never happened. No such destruction has ever happened. It's like the prophecy of Isaiah 17. It still must happen because Damascus was never totally obliterated. So too, Amman, Jordan was never totally obliterated. And Amman, Jordan is a huge city. 75% of the population of Jordan as a nation lives in and around Amman. This has never happened, but it must happen. Partial fulfillments in the history past, yes. When the Jews came back from Babylon, in time, they emerged after the Seleucid period, and the Hasmoneans were somewhat a regional power, and they did get strategic control of the east bank of the Dead Sea and so forth. But the prophecy in this kind of detail of the sons of Ammon being like Gomorrah and so forth, this has never happened. A perpetual desolation, we read in verse 9. No, it's never been a perpetual desolation. Jordan has never been a perpetual desolation. It's not happened, but it must happen. Okay. We continue. Verse 19. This they will have in return for their pride, because they had taunted and become arrogant against the people of the Lord of hosts. Ha'am Adonai Tzevaot. Now look what it says. We are told, first of all, that they are the people of the Lord. They are the people of the Lord. Secondly, we are told that the land is the Lord's. The remainder of my nation will inherit them. Verse 18. Make no mistake about it. It does not depend on the infidelity or even the rejection of Yeshua by most Jews and by Israel. It only depends on God's patriarchal promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It only depends on what you read in Genesis 49. It only depends on what God promised the fathers. Romans 11 tells us this. They remain beloved for the sake of their fathers. Now, are they going to suffer a terrible, ugly history because of their rejection of the Messiah? Yes. Who would want a history like the Jews have had? Will Jews who reject their Messiah go to hell? Not only will they go to hell, but they'll be the first ones there, according to Romans. According to Romans, because the gospel is available to them first, the consequences for rejecting it are upon them first. Salvation is available to them first by virtue of covenant, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. But there'll be tribulation for every man who rejects the Lord, to the Jew first and also the Greek. Because the salvation, the blessing, is for the Jew first by virtue of patriarchal promise and covenant, so too are the ramifications of rejecting it. Nonetheless, despite it, it's not about them. It's about God's promise. It is still His nation. It is still His land. They are still His people. Now, we have some new people joining us. I'll explain this very quickly for the sake of those who may not be familiar. The rest of you may plug your ears for a very few minutes. Nearly all of the time, the New Testament, with very limited exception, makes a distinction between the people of God and the children of God. Israel and the Jews are the people of God. Born-again believers, Jew or non-Jew, are the children of God. In Great Britain, you have Prince Charles, the future king. Prince Charles, on his father's descent, his paternal pedigree is Greco-English. It's Grecian descent. His father's family were Greek, Anglo-Greek. His mother was Hanoverian German, and her mother was from Scotland, a Celt from Scotland, the former Queen Mother. Prince Charles does not have a single drop of Welsh blood in his veins. Not a drop. He has no Welsh DNA whatsoever. No Welsh markers. He's not Welsh. Hanoverian German, Scottish, Celt, Greek. He's hardly an Englishman, but he's certainly not a Welshman. Yet he's the Prince of Wales. Why? He's not even one of the people of Wales. They forced him to learn Welsh as a kid because he was the Prince of Wales. They had him tutored to learn Welsh, but he had nothing Welsh about him. Most of his property is in the Duchy of Cornwall. He doesn't even have much in Wales. But he's the Prince of Wales. Why is he the Prince of Wales if he's not Welsh? Because he is the Son. Believers have their status not based on birth, but based on second birth. Christians in any nation, China, Britain, Europe, the States, Latin America, Africa, Far East, it doesn't matter. They're the children of God. But they're not the people of God. The Jews are the people of God. A reprobate people? Yes. A people in rejection of their own Messiah? Yes. A people who have violated the Torah and the covenants? Yes. But they're still his people. He does not perpetually give them up. Lo ami, they're not my people, it says in Hosea, but then he takes them back. They remain the people of God. The land remains his. When we get to Zechariah chapter 12 and the final showdown comes, we see whose side Jesus is on. He fights for his people after his children have been raptured. Now, it is possible to be a natural branch, like my wife, my kids. It is possible to be one of the people who are also one of the children. It is possible for one of the people to be a child. John 1:12, he came to his own, the Jews, but his own did not believe. But in context, but whoever believed, he gave the right to become the children of God. Now, is that extended for all nations? Yes. But in its immediate exegetical context, it's talking about Jews. They were his own, his people, but they're not his children. You can be one of his people by birth, but you can only be one of his children by second birth. Okay, the rest of you can unplug your ears. I had to explain this. Well, let's continue looking at this. Verse 11. The Lord will be terrifying to them. He will starve all the gods of the earth, and all the coastlands of the nations will bow down to him, everyone from his own place. Jesus is Lord. Allah will be debunked. Krishna, Rama, Sita will be debunked. That imposter, the Queen of Heaven, pretending to be Mary, will be debunked. She's Diana of Ephesus. She's Artemis, but she's not Miriam. The gods of the earth will be debunked. One of the things you see in a rebellion is eclecticism, this merger of false religions coming together, and the apostate church and Israel joining in. To this syncretism. They will be dethroned. Now remember, we're reading both for the time it was written, and we are reading for the return of Christ. Also, there's elements for his first coming. You also, O Ethiopians, will be slain by my sword, for he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness. These things have historically happened. There have been mass destructions in Somalia, Ethiopia, going back to ancient times, what we call in Hebrew the land of Cush, the land of Cush. Black people are called Cushim, or Cushites in Hebrew, Cushim. Okay. These things have happened. But notice these same nations come into play again. Assyria, Northern Iraq, Nineveh. Flocks will lie down in her midst, all beasts which range in herds, both the pelican and the hedgehog. These are not kosher animals. These are unclean animals. Now we have a teaching on the bimbo and the basket or something like that from the book of Zephaniah about the birds of the air, the difference between kosher birds and unkosher birds, and birds that are terrestrial and birds that are not, that nest when they fly, and how every unclean bird, how the unkosher birds are pictures of demons. The birds come and devour the seed and so forth of the gospel. Be that as it may, I refer you to that teaching. But let's look at this. These unclean birds are going to come, okay? And they'll lodge at the tops of her pillars. Birds will sing in the windows. Desolation will be on the threshold, for he has laid bare the cedar work. It's going to be a haunt of demons. The cedar work, like the cedars of Lebanon, Arizim. Most of the temple, the construction, was covered cedar. King Hiram floated it down to Jaffa, and then it was taken overland by David to Jerusalem. Most of the temple was built with it. These are the cedars of Lebanon. Now we have a teaching called temple typology where we deal with this. How the church is the temple 7 times according to the New Testament. It is the naos, it is the oikos hagios, it is the heron and so forth. But most of the temple was cedars of Lebanon. Most of the church is made up of Gentile Christians. You understand? They're not native from Israel, where the gospel is from and where Jesus is from. They're from the Gentile nations. Most of what went into the temple's construction was from the Gentile nations. The Jews had the blueprint, but from God, but the materials and the labor, the building of it, were Gentile. Nobody could cut cedars like the Phoenicians were told, and that's repeated in Scripture. Now, again, I only mention this in passing. You can listen to the older recording on temple typology. Be that as it may, it's going to be exposed. The dry rot and the wet rot in the church is going to be exposed in the cedars. The apostasy will be exposed. The demonized nature of it. I watched a video clip 2 weeks ago. It was astounding, of Protestant clergymen promoting homosexuality as a Christian cause, including an Anglican bishop, believing they were doing the right thing. Well, the birds are singing in the window. The demons are in Lambeth Palace and in Canterbury Cathedral and in St. Paul's and in Lincoln Cathedral and in Liverpool Cathedral. The birds are singing in the window. It continues. This is the exultant city, which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am and there's no one beside me. How she has become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. Do you see what she says? It's in the female personified. I am and there's no one other than me. Look with me, please, to the book of Revelation. We read in chapter 18, verse 3 about the immorality and the rapprochement, or the connection between the kings of the earth, the political powers, and the immorality of this false religion, who commit acts of immorality with her. And then the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Goes on, come out of her, my people. Now look what she says, the way she thinks of herself. She says in verse 7, I sit as a queen, I'm not a widow, I'll never see mourning. Oblivious to the fact that it's the Lord who judges her, and he is strong. In the following verse 8. She thinks she's invisible. Now notice, it's the kings, the merchants, and the false religion, the harlot, of which apostate Christendom will be central. You will have commerce, industry, economy. You will have government, and you will have false religion. A tripod. A tripod can only stand if it has 3 legs. If there's only 2, it won't stand. These people in the corporate monopolies, these people in governments, they may outwardly profess to be agnostic. They don't believe, or they don't live according to what they say, but they will still be religious. Joe Biden, he is radically pro-abortion. He's radically in favor of the murder of babies. Yet he attends the Roman Catholic Church faithfully, and they will not excommunicate him. They need it. monopolies in the new economy, things like Google and Facebook and increasingly Amazon, they need government to eliminate competition and to put them in a privileged position. Government needs them. They'll just censor anything that the political establishment doesn't want to hear. This is what you wind up with. The merchants, the harlot, and the kings. It is no coincidence that right now, and again, I only mention this briefly, right now when they're talking about things like the Great Reset, with the advent of artificial intelligence and so forth, and going to a digital currency and things like this. This week, that guy in Europe, Schwab's a European. He's not American. Notice he comes from Europe, from Germany. The founder of the Davos Forum, World Economic Forum. It's coming from Europe, as Daniel said. Asia, America may be involved, but Schwab, I'm not saying he is the Antichrist, but he's certainly an Antichrist, and he's of that spirit. He openly says that COVID-19 should be used to advance the Great Reset. He openly says it. Bill Gates has said it, not with his words so much, only hinted at it, but he certainly said it with his actions. Now you've got Pope Francis playing the same card. You're going to have false religion. You're going to have a corrupt, monopolistic corporate business establishment and godless politicians. You're going to have the tripod that Revelation 17 says will be there. Religion is indispensable to this. Now, unfortunately, the apostate church, and by apostate church, I don't mean the obvious apostate church like Rome or liberal Protestants or the World Council of Churches. That's a given. I mean apostate evangelicism will be a player on this team. There's too much money and power involved. Remember, the false religions at the end of the age are like liberal Protestantism, but not only them, holding the form of religion, but denying the power therein. They have no spiritual power. They have no spiritual power other than of a demonic nature. The World Council of Churches, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, now the Southern Baptists, they have no spiritual power, none. Greer, the president of the Southern Baptists, once the Baptists, says evangelicals should be the most outspoken proponents of homosexual and lesbian rights. These are Baptists claiming to be born again. Those birds are chirping through the window of the Baptist church. And you see, not many are standing up and speaking out. The Lord is not talking to them anymore. He only speaks to the humble of the land who abide by his ordinances. who say non-therapeutic abortion is wrong, who say homosexuality is wrong, who say divorce and remarriage for arbitrary reasons, unless the unbeliever leaves, is wrong, who say these things are wrong, these things which will saturate someone with shame when they stand before the Lord, are not seen as shameful. They're not seen as any kind of a moral indictment, except among the so-called humble, who follow his ordinances. This goes on. Well, what do we see next? Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. We'll pick up from there next week, but let's look at the present situation. Some years ago, I did a conference in England with Dave Hunt. He was my dear friend and brother, now with the Lord. Look forward to seeing him again. And we did a conference together, me, him, I think it was Chuck Missler or somebody. And he was also with the Lord. Now, anyway, the Lord gave me a message which I delivered called The Death of Reason. And in The Death of Reason, I pointed out that the scripture tells us we have the power of sound mind and that our faith is reasonable. It's not reasonable to be a Hindu. It's not reasonable to drink contaminated water from the Ganges and die of cholera and think it's holy. It's not reasonable. It's not reasonable to be a Muslim. How can Miriam, the sister of Moses, and Miriam, the mother of Jesus, be the same woman when they lived at least 13 centuries apart? How can you believe a religion? When you read the Hadith, they were drinking cow urine. How can you believe? It's just not reasonable. Not reasonable. Our faith is not intellectual, but it's intellectually defensible. It's reasonable. We are called to have the power of sound mind. The power of sound mind. Not to be crazy. Now, of course, Satan got in through people like Michael Brown and John Arnott and Wynne Lewis and with the Toronto and Pensacola and the counterfeit revivals, and people were acting out of their mind. They were acting virtually foaming at the mouth, rolling on the floor. They were not behaving reasonably. The fruit of the Spirit is always a krete, self-controlled. We're told twice in the New Testament, a krete. When you see people out of control, that means the Holy Spirit is not in control of them. If the Holy Spirit's in control of somebody, they'll be in control of themselves. This forfeiture of reason. You see it in the mass demonization with radical Islamic rallies. Just go to a funeral of a terrorist in the Gaza Strip. You'll see this mass demonization. It's similar to what the Germans did with Hitler. Or you see this with Kundalini Yoga in India. Well, you see this among lunatic fringe evangelicals who listen to people like Michael Brown and so forth, and John Arnott and these people, and Randy Clark and all that laughing drunken stuff, Nicky Gumbel and these things. Our faith is reasonable, and we have the power of sound mind, because the world is crazy. The scripture juxtaposes those who are in Christ with the world, and it says the world is crazy. We're not supposed to be crazy. We have the mind of Christ. We're not supposed to be crazy. In the eyes of the world, we may be fools for Christ, but we're not crazy. Well, the death of reason. When you say to someone, and I pointed this out, you can go to the message of the death of reason. So, you believe in evolution? Yes. Okay. And you believe in science? Yes. So, if you go to Oxford University or to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology or to California, Caltech, or Stanford, or one of these very top universities in the world, or Princeton University, or Cambridge University, and you go to the Faculty of Information Science, and the professors there will tell you, although there are software programs that can write other software programs, someone had to write the master program. In other words, information science, computer science says that information cannot come from a vacuum. It requires a pre-existing intelligence. Organized information, data, particularly encrypted data, cannot come from a vacuum. The human genome alone has 13 billion lines of information if you were to digitalize it, and it has been digitalized. 13 billion! A really sophisticated computer would have like 100,000. The human genome, just the human genome, 13 billion. How can this come from a vacuum? So in information science, they say it can't come from a vacuum, but you cross the campus and you go to the Faculty of Biomedical Sciences and they'll tell you it can. How do you reconcile this? How can you get genetic coding when it is encrypted, digitalized information? You have nucleotide sequencing and DNA and so forth. How can you get encrypted, organized information of that complexity, particularly out of a vacuum, when information science says you cannot? There was no information science when Darwin was around. They can't answer that question. They go into cognitive dissonance. They try to believe two mutually exclusive things at the same time. So you believe in what you call gay rights? Yes. And you're a Darwinist? Yes. And you think those people were born that way? Yes. Do you have any genetic proof? No. But you believe it? Yes. Well, if you're a Darwinist and you believe those people were born that way, they are genetically inferior. You must believe homosexuals and lesbians to be genetically inferior if you're a Darwinist, because they cannot reproduce. It's survival of the fittest. Do you believe in saving the whales and protecting endangered species? Oh, yes. Why? They're not supposed to survive if you're a Darwinist. And some of them, Jonas Salk, who discovered polymyxin, he admitted this contradiction on television in America. Unbelievable. Cognitive dissonance. You show a Jehovah's Witness. Look, Jehovah says in Deuteronomy, and there's copies of the Watchtower that admit it, that people who predict things in the name of Jehovah that don't happen are false prophets. Yes, it says that. Well, here's Charles Taze Russell. Here's Rutherford. Here's Nathan Noor. Here's your own leaders doing it. Jesus will be back in 1914. He'll be back in 1915. He'll be back in 1927. He'll be back in 1975. Out the door. Cognitive dissonance. It's illogical, it's irrational. There's no power of sound mind. When people believe things that are false, they lose the power of sound mind. It doesn't matter how intelligent they are, how educated they are. It only matters what they believe. Lose the power of sound mind. Now that in itself is an indictment of these counterfeit revivals of Pensacola and Toronto that went on 20 years ago, and people like Michael Brown. It's an indictment of them. It's an indictment. The very fact that they do this stuff, they don't have the power of sound mind. It proves it's not God. No, it goes on. Can't you see what's happening? I asked black people in America, why is it that you reject black people who warn you against liberal politicians? I mean, Malcolm X said the worst thing that could happen to black people are white liberals. You respect Malcolm X? Yes. Well, this is what he said. Why are you going to say to them, look, my family, Irish, Jewish. You'll get a Jew who's a liberal, a Jew who's a conservative, a Democrat, Republican, Labor Party, Libertarian, Independent, Green Party, whatever. But you're not going to find the Jew in the Nazi Party. Irish people, they may be Fenians, they may be Sinn Féin, they may be, any party, SDLP or whatever, but they're not going to vote Unionist. You're not going to find an Armenian person who's going to vote for an Islamic Turkish nationalist, someone like Erdogan, because of what was done to them. Because of the potato famine and things like that, the Irish are not going to, the Jews are not going to, because of the Holocaust. Why would a black person vote for the party of Jim Crow and of slavery? No white person would do that. Can you answer why you vote for the party who did? It's not reasonable, is it? Well, you think it's different now? It's been 50 years since civil rights. Where are most abortion clinics located? In and around Afro-American communities in the States. They need enough blacks to get themselves reelected like they did before the Civil War. You could vote 3/5, 60% of your slaves for the candidate of your choice. That's how the Southern plantation owners kept political power. They told the blacks how to vote. You just want enough to keep power and to keep an underclass. Not too many. What are you doing now? They see the abortion in the black community as a way to reduce future prison populations and future welfare rolls. They cull the Afro-American population by killing black babies in their mother's womb. They just elected a senator standing in the pulpit of Martin Luther King's church who is one of the most radically pro-abortion figures in the United States. They vote for their own death. They vote for the death of their own children. How can you justify it? They lost their mind. There's no reason. They become crazy. And when you try to tell such people such things and say the reason these terrible things are happening to society is because you're turning away from the ordinances of God. That's why you have Darwinism. That's why you have these things. Social injustice, that's why you have these things. They tell you you're crazy. Again, it's not to do with aptitude or education. It's not to do with that. It's to do with sin and willful rebellion. It makes people stupid. And it doesn't matter how uneducated you are. The gospel makes people smarter. It's not about natural intelligence or education. That's another thing. We have a teaching dealing with that called the real gospel of health and wealth. But it's not about that. Anybody who walks with Jesus is going to be smart. He knows everything, and he's going to tell you what you need to know. Anybody who doesn't walk with Jesus is going to be stupid. Ultimately self-destructive. And that's what's happening. The tripod is being set up. Notice, just like it says in Daniel, it's coming from Europe. The Great Reset. Well, the first cousin, the natural bedfellow of the Great Reset, is obviously going to be the ecumenical movement and the interfaith movement. They're made for each other. And the kings of the earth, not the king, the kings of the earth. They must destroy nationalism in any sense that it can't be controlled by the tripod interest. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I am not. I am simply looking at what is happening in light of prophecy. I'm not an alarmist, but I see it. It's the merchants, the kings of the earth, and false religion. And that false religion includes apostate evangelicism. But God is appealing. He's appealing to those who follow his word. He's not talking to these people anymore. They've gone too far. They've done what Judah did in the days of King Manasseh. They went too far with killing the kids. They've aborted too many babies. He's not even dealing with them. Remember when God told Jeremiah, don't even pray for these people anymore? Don't even pray for them? In Romans 1, we are told 3 times that people who push the homosexual and lesbian agenda and enter into that, it says 3 times, God gives them over. They're given over. Don't even pray for them. You look at that homosexual newscaster in America, Don Lemon, who hates Christian values and things. Just look at him. He's given over. Now, these people get the upper hand. They do get the upper hand. We see this in the book of Revelation. In temporal terms, they seem to get the upper hand. The people of God must be hidden, rescued, evacuated, and they're persecuted. They get the upper hand. Why do the wicked prosper? This is in Jeremiah. It's in Psalm 73. Why do the wicked prosper? They're prospering in the church. They're in control of the denominations. The wicked are in control of the denominations. Assemblies of God, the Baptists, the Anglicans. This pro-abortion senator is a Methodist clergyman. I think he's a Methodist. But he's in a Baptist church. It doesn't matter. They're in control. The wicked prosper. You look at these godless people. They will not censor pornography or anything like that. They will censor political opinion or moral opinion. That Dorsey and Zuckerberg, Google, that Polish American woman, the wicked prosper. Politically, George Bush is looking forward, he says, to the inauguration of Biden. Oh, they're two of a kind. Two of a kind. The wicked prosper. Oh, Obama and Clinton and the Feinstein and Schumer and this new guy Warnock. Why do the wicked prosper? Because they are being set up. Very frustrating to see the wicked prosper. It's very frustrating to see the godly suppressed, even persecuted. But then I perceived their end. I perceive their end. I don't know if there can be another period of respite. I don't know if there can be another revival before the Lord comes, but if there is, it can't happen in this present state the church is in. It'll have to come from outside of it. The way the hippies, the Jesus movement was outside the mainstream denominations. And it'd have to be something like that. Denominational Christianity is too far gone. Even ones that used to be good are not what they were, like Calvary chapels and things. You can't go with any of these things anymore. And people like John MacArthur have lost their mind. You can take the mark of the beast and all this stuff and still be saved. And even he's lost his mind. They're crazy. No. It's nothing to do now. The question is, what is God saying to those who keep his ordinances? To those who want to live scripturally? It's going to get so sick if this reset happens with the advent of AI. You mark my word. I warned about this 25, 30 years ago. I said virtual technology is going to become so advanced, people will artificially construct their own delusional reality and think they're Napoleon or Cinderella and escape into the cyber world. And that will be their reality. It won't matter what happens in the outside world. I remember witnessing to an unsaved guy smoke cigars and think, and I just try to tell him, he would just say, "No, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it." He thought that by saying he didn't believe in something, that dismissed any possibility of the reality of it. Just because he said, I don't believe it, I don't believe it, that meant it didn't exist to him. When he gives up the ghost, he finds out it does exist, and it's too late. We did a teaching some time ago, about a year ago, on the narrative, and how people follow the narrative. Yeah. It's like when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the narrative was Marxism, which is based on a Darwinistic Hegelian model that says as capitalism evolved from feudalism, so communism will come from capitalism. Therefore, England should have been the first communist country because it was the first capitalist one, but instead it happens in Russia, the last feudal country. Direct contradiction to what Marxism was based on, philosophically. Again, that was Darwinistic. Darwinism and Hegel's philosophy. You said, look, it didn't happen what Marx said. It didn't evolve the way he said. It happened in Russia, a feudal country. It didn't happen in Britain, a capitalist country. That doesn't fit the narrative. You tell people, look, how can you believe the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church? Look at the pedophilia and the cover-up. Now the Pope is saying homosexuality is all right. Nome Padre, cum Filio, cum Spiritus Sancto. They'll still believe it. Maybe in a cognitively dissonant way, but it doesn't matter. But with AI, it's going to get worse. One of the main components, one of the things fueling the drive for the so-called reset is artificial intelligence. Forget about things like internet pornography. In artificial intelligence, you'll be able to act out that fantasy in a cyber world. It's going to involve robotics. It's going to... People, they're going to replace sex with cyber sex and robotics. Mark my words, it will happen. You want to date with Marilyn Monroe? No problem. Give us your credit card number. We'll have her at your place in 2 minutes, 2 seconds. It's going to get like that. People will enter an artificial cyber world that will become their functional reality, except it's not real. And when that happens, they'll believe anything. They'll do anything. You look, I can't get out. All the restaurants are closed. The theaters are closed. I can't go to a ball game. I'm just stuck in the house all the time because of the lockdown. So people, where are they going? They're going online. We can't go to church anymore. Well, we'll have church on Zoom, the electronic church. And eventually, when you say in a sermon homosexuality is wrong, Google will close you down for hate speech. It violates their policy. They'll have a radical Muslim on there, but not you. This is what it's coming to. The problem is there is no telling these people anymore. God is not interested in telling them. He is only appealing to those who carry out his ordinances. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. God is getting angrier and angrier and angrier. When his wrath explodes, it'll be beyond human comprehension. It's coming. That whore is going to die in Revelation 17. Those kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, we know these things are setting the stage for the Antichrist and false prophet, aren't they? They're going to follow him. Ultimately, but by the grace of God, those who keep his word won't. We will be hidden. We have to use common sense. Jesus said, when they persecute you in this city, flee to the next. We have to use common sense. Faith and common sense are not mutually exclusive. Pray before you take an aspirin, but don't think God can't use medical science. Faith and common sense are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, we have the power of sound mind. Our faith is reasonable. Once again, use common sense. But in times of tribulation and persecution, it's not the wrath of man we have to be afraid of. It's the wrath of God that's coming against them. And when they mess with Israel, and when they persecute the true church, God takes it very, very personally. What would you do if somebody abused your child? Look at history. What's happened to every nation that ever persecuted the Jews? Look what happened to them. And it happened quickly. You build the wall around the Warsaw Ghetto, any Jew climb over the wall gets machine gunned. Within a few years, a wall is built around Berlin. Any German climbing over the wall gets machine gunned. I've seen it. Spain was the world power until the Inquisition. Then Francis Drake sunk the Armada and Britannia ruled the waves. Then Britain revoked the Bellflower Declaration. Let the Jews burn instead of going home to the land they promised them. So Coventry and London and Liverpool burned, and Britannia no longer ruled the waves. It's always been like that throughout history. Anybody who messed with them, God has taken it personally. Who will be hidden? No, don't worry. God has a controversy with his people, but they're his people. Takes his things personally. No, friends, don't worry about man. Use common sense, be led by the Holy Spirit, but don't worry about the wrath of man. It's the wrath of God that's coming. And it's going to be infinitely more ferocious and eternal. We can be hidden. Let us, in his grace, keep his ordinances, keep his word. Now I know, dies irae, dies ira. Tribulationes et angustiae, dies calamititas et miserae, dies tenebrarum, et calignos dies nebulae et turbinis. That's all true. But it's also true that Jesus said, when you see these things happening, lift up your head. Your redemption draws near.